May 1944. The coast of Kent, England. The air hums with a power unlike anything the ancient county has ever known. To the casual observer, or more importantly, to the high-flying reconnaissance pilot of the Luftwaffe, the fields and forests around Dover are bursting with the machinery of war. Endless parks of Sherman tanks sit glinting in the spring Sunday convoys of trucks clog the lanes, and the skies are loud with the roar of fighter squadrons. This is the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG. The elite invasion force, commanded by the Allies' most feared and aggressive general, George S. Patton, Jr. This is the mailed fist aimed at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest, most logical crossing point to invade Fortress Europe. But just over 100 miles to the southwest, in the ports of Devon and Cornwall, an even greater force, the real force, sits heavily cloaked in secrecy, its men tense, its purpose hidden. The discrepancy between these two scenes was the single greatest secret of the Second World War. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, would ultimately succeed not merely because of the overwhelming force applied to the beaches of Normandy, but because of the paralyzing power of a phantom force that never existed, an army built of air, rubber, and imagination, aimed squarely at the Pas-de-Calais. This is not just the story of an invasion. It is the story of the grandest deception ever staged, a strategic masterwork of psychological warfare that held Hitler's most powerful armies in check, saving Normandy from disaster by convincing the German high command to stare at a ghost. The architect of the real invasion, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, carried a burden that was almost beyond human comprehension. The success of Operation Overlord hinged on one fragile element: tactical surprise. If the Germans deduced the true landing zone at Normandy, they could concentrate their panzer divisions and reserves, turning the beaches into a bloodbath and shattering the invasion before it ever established a foothold. In his post-war memoirs, Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower spoke of this intolerable pressure. Surprise, he wrote, was a vital factor in the chosen plan. If the enemy should be successful in penetrating our scheme of maneuver, he could concentrate, particularly in the air, so effectively against us as to prevent our landing. This fear governed every decision. Eisenhower understood that Overlord was not just a battle. It was a logistical colossus. Its failure was not an option. Therefore, the plan for the invasion had to be twofold. First, the accumulation of the real force. Second, the creation of a believable, and arguably more terrifying, fake force. This dual strategy was codenamed Operation Fortitude. Eisenhower was not just a general of armies. He was forced to become a producer of a vast, elaborate piece of theater. He authorized the creation of FUSAG as a critical component of this strategy, a phantom designed to be loud, visible, and menacing. All while the real invasion force, General Montgomery's 21st Army Group, huddled under a blanket of unprecedented censorship and camouflage. But how does one create an army from nothing? The idea did not spring from Eisenhower alone. It was born in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of the London Controlling Section, LCS, the Allies' senior deception planning organization. Led by the meticulous and cerebral Colonel John Bevan, the LCS was the very opposite of the bombastic Patton. They were academics, lawyers, and even a former magician, tasked with waging a war of the mind. Their job was to analyze the enemy's psyche, find their biases, and then feed those biases with precisely the information they expected to see. Declassified LCS reports and the memoirs of its members reveal a clinically precise methodology. The target was not the German army. The target was the mind of Adolf Hitler and his intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr. Bevan and his team deduced that the German High Command and Hitler himself were strategically fixated on the Pas-de-Calais. It was the logical choice. This geographic imperative became the cornerstone of Operation Fortitude. As planner Sir Ronald Wingate noted, the goal was to build up in the enemy's mind a picture of our intentions, which would be partly true and partly false. The LCS plan was not just to suggest Calais. It was to confirm, beyond any shadow of a doubt, the enemy's deepest, held assumption. They would not invent a new idea. They would simply amplify the one the Germans already believed. The power of this assumption is found not in opinions, but in cold, hard numbers. The strategic geography of the English Channel made Pas-de-Calais the obvious target. At its narrowest, the Strait of Dover is a mere 21 miles wide. This short distance offered immense advantages. It meant the shortest sea voyage for troop transports, minimizing exposure to U-boats and E-boats. Crucially, it would allow Allied fighter aircraft, including the medium-range Spitfires and Thunderbolts, to provide continuous air cover over the beachhead from their bases in Kent. Furthermore, Calais was the closest landing point to the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. A rapid breakout from Calais could, in theory, cripple German war production and end the war in 1944. The Germans knew this. Their entire defensive strategy, the Atlantic Wall, reflected this obsession. The 15th Army, commanded by General Hans von Salmuth, was the most powerful German formation in the West. It possessed the highest concentration of heavy coastal batteries, the thickest minefields, and the strongest concrete bunkers. More critically, it held the bulk of the panzer divisions in reserve, positioned to counterattack any landing at Calais within hours. Normandy, by contrast, was seen as a secondary diversionary threat. The LCS and Eisenhower did not have to invent this German fixation. They merely had to exploit it. The 15th Army was the prize. If Operation Fortitude could keep that army immobilized at Calais, even for just a few weeks after the real landings, Normandy would have the breathing room it needed to survive. The deception was not a sideshow. It was the entire key to the invasion's success. The concept was approved. Now they needed someone to build the Phantom Army. If the Calais deception was the strategic goal, the London controlling section was the brain that conceived it. Housed in the anonymous corridors of power near Whitehall, the LCS was an organization unique in the annals of warfare, chartered directly by Winston Churchill, with the ambiguous and powerful mandate to coordinate deception on a global scale. Its chief, Colonel John Bevan, was a figure worlds removed from the popular image of a military commander. A stockbroker in civilian life, Bevan was patient, intellectual, and possessed a mind that saw war not as a clash of armies, but as a contest of perceptions. He understood that in modern, total war, misleading the enemy's high command was as potent as destroying a division. Bevan and his small, hand-picked team, which included a lawyer, an academic, and even a peer of the realm, operated on a principle of supreme intellectual arrogance. That they could think better, and more logically, than their counterparts in Berlin. They analyzed German intelligence intercepts, read Hitler's directives, and built a psychological profile of the enemy. Their conclusion, as laid out in the master plan for 1944, Operation Bodyguard, of which Fortitude was the key component, was that the Germans were rigid, methodical, and prone to confirm their own biases. Bevan's plan was not to create confusion, but to create a false, competing clarity. He would not simply obscure the truth about Normandy. He would build a more compelling, more logical, and more resource-heavy truth aimed at Calais. While Bevan was the strategic architect, the operational nuts and bolts required a different kind of genius, one found in the eccentric and brilliant Colonel David Strangeways. If Bevan was the cool, calculating mind, Strangeways was the fiery, tempestuous artist, a man known for his abrasive personality and his utter intolerance for fools. Strangeways was the man who had famously engineered the deception that led to the victory at El Alamein, Operation Bertram. He was a master of the how. When Strangeways was brought into the planning for Operation Fortitude, he embraced it with a fanatical devotion to detail. It was he who reportedly coined the phrase that Churchill would later make famous: "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Strangeways' contribution was the insistence that a deception could not just be whispered. It had to be shouted from every possible angle. It was not enough to send a false report. You had to have a fake army, with fake insignia, fake radio traffic, fake supply dumps, and even fake garbage, all telling the same lie. He was the one who translated Bevan's grand strategy into a tangible, multisensory experience. He devised the plan for the physical, visible presence of FUSAG, the sonic deception, the radio deception, and the myriad of other tricks that would give the Phantom Army its corporeal form. He understood that the Germans would be cross-referencing information. A spy's report would be checked against radio intercepts, which would be checked against aerial reconnaissance. Strangeways' job was to ensure that every channel the Germans listened to told them one thing, and one thing only. Patton is coming to Calais. This obsessive, multi-layered approach leads to the third, and perhaps most critical, pillar of the entire deception: the delivery mechanism. It was one thing to invent a lie, but another to inject it directly into the veins of the German High Command. This was the work of the double-cross system, or XX system, managed with academic precision by Sir John Masterman of the British Security Service, MI5. Masterman, an Oxford historian, oversaw one of the most staggering counterintelligence coups of the war. By 1944, through a painstaking process of capture, interrogation, and turning, MI5 had gained control of every single Times German intelligence agent operating within Great Britain. There were no independent German spies left. All of them, from the most trusted to the most minor, were now unwittingly working for the Allies, broadcasting only the scripts given to them by their British handlers. In his meticulous post-war report, The Double-Cross System, Masterman detailed the mechanics of this unprecedented operation. The XX Committee fed its network of double agents, a carefully curated diet of 90% verifiable, low-level truth, and 10% catastrophic, high-level lies. This built unbreakable trust. The Germans believed their agents were the most successful intelligence assets they possessed. This network was the pipeline. Bevan and Strangeways could invent the most brilliant deception, but it was Masterman's agents who would package it as a secret stolen from the highest levels of Allied command and deliver it to a grateful Abwehr, who would then pass it directly to Hitler's desk. The entire German intelligence picture of the Allied order of battle was now a canvas, and the Allies held the only brush. With the why, Bevan, the how, Strangeways, and the who, Masterman, established, Operation Fortitude was divided into two major, continent-spanning prongs. The first was Operation Fortitude North. This was a vast, strategic lie aimed at Scandinavia by creating a fictional British Fourth Army based in Scotland, complete with its own radio traffic, headquarters, and even fake diplomatic overtures to neutral Sweden. The Allies convinced Hitler that they intended to invade Norway. The deception was wildly successful. It pinned down over 250,000 German troops, some 27 divisions in Norway, waiting for an invasion that would never come. These were men and machines that could have been reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. But the main effort was Operation Fortitude South. This was the crown jewel, the creation of the first U.S. Army group, FUSAG. This was not a small deception. It was the fabrication of an entire army group, the largest single formation in the Allied order of battle. On paper, FUSAG was a behemoth of over 1 million men, comprising multiple armies, corps, and divisions. It was intended to be the primary invasion force, the one that would strike the decisive blow. Its existence had to be proven to the Germans through every means possible. This required a statistical hammer of its own. It meant simulating the radio traffic of hundreds of distinct units, creating the physical infrastructure for 1 million men, and generating the thousands of daily bureaucratic signals, supply requests, leave passes, divisional transfers that a real army of that size would produce. The architects had their plan, their tools, and their target. Now, they needed to build the stage and hire the actors for their grand play. The creation of the first U.S. Army Group was an act of bureaucratic alchemy, a masterpiece of forgery on an industrial scale. Before a single rubber tank could be inflated, FUSAG had to exist on paper. In the quiet offices of SHAEF, deception planners waged a war of ledgers and typewriters. They understood that modern armies are not just fighting forces, they are vast administrative machines that leave an indelible paper trail. The German intelligence services, known for their methodical nature, would be looking for this trail. The Allies' task was to provide it. It began with the Allied Order of Battle, the official roster of fighting units. The deception staff systematically falsified this document. FUSAG was officially activated, on paper, and given a headquarters. Real divisions, newly arrived from the United States and still green, would land in Britain and be publicly assigned to FUSAG. Their insignia would be seen in Kent and East Anglia. German intelligence would duly note their arrival and place them on the map opposite Calais. What the Germans didn't see was the next secret step. Under a blanket of total movement control and media blackout, these same divisions would be transferred, one by one, to General Montgomery's 21st Army Group, the real invasion force assembling in the southwest. But on the German maps, they remained stubbornly fixed in Kent, under Patton's command. The bureaucratic footprint extended far beyond just unit rosters. The deception staff at SHAEF, working under the codename Operation Quicksilver, created an entire ecosystem of administrative paperwork. Fake staff appointments were announced for FUSAG headquarters. Voluminous, detailed logistical requests were generated. The Phantom Army requested millions of gallons of fuel, thousands of tons of ammunition, and specific types of bridging equipment ideal for the rivers north of the Seine, not in Normandy. They produced fake medical plans, requesting hospital capacity in the east of England, and even generated phony civil affairs directives for the administration of occupied Pas-de-Calais. This paper army was so detailed, so complex, and so administratively real that it was indistinguishable from the genuine article. Allied commanders planning the real invasion often complained that the deception staff had stolen all the best unit designations and logistical priority, hamstringing their own efforts in the name of the Phantom. This paper trail was then given a voice, a deafening, electronic voice that screamed Calais. This was Operation Quicksilver 2, the radio deception component, and it was perhaps the most brilliant technical feat of the entire plan, managed by the U.S. 3103rd Signal Service Battalion. This unit was composed of men specially trained to mimic the unique radio signatures of different command elements. In 1,940 seconds radio communication, every operator has a distinct fist or pattern of tapping the Morse code key. Different units also have unique protocols, call signs, and traffic patterns. The 3103rd learned to fake them all. From a central transmitter, they began to broadcast the radio traffic of an entire army group. They didn't just send random noise. They simulated the mundane, daily chatter of Patton's fictional headquarters contacting its fictional corps, who in turn contacted their fictional divisions. They simulated tank units checking in, artillery batteries requesting fire missions, and quartermasters arguing about supplies. To the German radio intercept stations strung along the French coast, this sudden explosion of high-priority traffic from Kent was undeniable proof. The electronic center of gravity of the Allied invasion force was clearly opposite Calais. The signals were so convincing that the German intelligence analyst, Baron Alexis von Roen, a man trusted by Hitler himself, confidently reported that the main Allied army group was in Kent. He was not wrong. He was just listening to a recording. The paper army had a voice, but it needed a physical body. The final layer of the deception was the most audacious. Building a physical, three-dimensional world for this phantom force to inhabit, one that could be seen and photographed by high-flying Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes. This was not a subtle effort. It was a sprawling construction project designed to create the times-illusion times of logistical saturation. The Royal Engineers and U.S. Places Army engineers began a massive, pointless building campaign across Kent and East Anglia. The statistics of this phantom infrastructure are staggering. Hundreds of miles of new roads were bulldozed into the countryside, connecting fields to forests, all leading to staging areas that held nothing. Fake railway sidings were built, complete with signals and water towers, to service non-existent supply depots. Vast ammunition dumps were created, consisting of thousands of empty crates and oil drums, carefully stacked and then covered with camouflage netting just poorly enough to be spotted from the air. The goal was to make it look like the Allies were trying to hide something, confirming the reconnaissance pilot's skill. In the ports and estuaries of the East Coast, the illusion took on an amphibious form. Special units constructed hundreds of dummy landing craft, codenamed Big Bobs, made of canvas and wood, and floated them in the harbors, suggesting a massive invasion fleet was assembling there, not in the concealed ports of the Southwest. This visible evidence was overwhelming. It confirmed the paper reports, which confirmed the radio intercepts, which confirmed the spies' messages. Every single source of German intelligence was now telling them the same, comprehensive lie. The stage was set, the bureaucratic army was in place, and the radio was broadcasting. But the stage was still empty of its actors. The soldiers, the tanks, and the guns. The paper army now required a physical form, a three-dimensional illusion so convincing it could pass inspection from 30,000 feet. This was the mission of one of the most unusual units of the entire war. The U.S. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known simply as the Ghost Army. This was a corps of phantoms, a 1,100-man unit recruited not for their combat prowess, but for their creativity. It was a collection of artists, architects, sound engineers, and advertising designers, all tasked with creating a battlefield populated by rubber and hot air. In the fields of Kent and East Anglia, these soldiers engaged in a surreal form of warfare. Their main weapon was the M4 Sherman tank, not a 30-ton steel beast, but a 93-pound inflatable replica made of vulcanized rubber. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers, a core component of the 23rd, would arrive at a bare field in the morning. By evening, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot flying overhead would photograph a complete armored division, its tanks perfectly parked in orderly rows, its artillery pieces dug in, and its motor pool filled with trucks. These men were masters of stagecraft. In his post-war interviews, Bill Blass, who would later become a world-famous fashion designer, described his work as a corporal in the 603rd. His job was not to fight, but to create an atmosphere of hustle and bustle. The illusion, he explained, had to be imperfect to be believable. If you're a German reconnaissance pilot, Blass noted, you're looking for something that's trying to be hidden. The Ghost Army would deliberately apply sloppy camouflage netting, just enough to suggest a real unit was trying, and failing, to conceal itself. They drove real tanks in circles around the inflatables, to create the telltale tracks in the mud that photo interpreters would look for. They even created fake latrines, and hung laundry out to dry. It was a complete lived-in performance. Artist Art Kane, another member of the unit, recalled the sheer absurdity and the deadly seriousness of the mission. Our job was to be seen. We were putting on a show for an audience of one, and that audience was the German High Command. This visual show was paired with an equally sophisticated auditory one. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company, the sonic deception arm of the 23rd, gave the Rubber Army its voice. This was not simply playing loud noises. It was a curated library of high-fidelity recordings, captured at Fort Knox, of every sound a real army makes. They had recordings of armored divisions on the move, engineering units building pontoon bridges, and infantry units digging in. These sounds were played on massive, 500-pound speakers mounted on the backs of half-tracks, their signal powerful enough to be heard clearly up to 15 miles away. Declassified technical reports from the 3,132nd reveal the psychological precision of their work. They didn't just play a jumble of sounds. They performed scripts. At night, they would blast the recording of an armored column arriving, which would then be followed by the sounds of the tanks stopping, idling, and then the men dismounting and making camp. German flash spotting and sound ranging units, whose job was to triangulate the position of enemy activity by sound, would pick up these broadcasts. Their reports to the 15th Army headquarters were terrifying and unambiguous. A massive American armored force was massing directly opposite Calais, and it was so confident, it wasn't even bothering with radio silence. The sound of FUSAG's arrival was, for the Germans on the coast, the undeniable prelude to invasion. The industrial and statistical scale of this phantom army was immense. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops ultimately deployed over 1,100 inflatable vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and even a squadron of P-51 Mustang fighters made of rubber and canvas. They simulated the radio traffic of two full-size divisions, roughly 30,000 men, with a crew of just a few hundred. The Luftwaffe, despite its waning strength, flew its reconnaissance missions and dutifully photographed the sprawling tank parks and dummy airfields. These photos were sent back to Baron von Roen's intelligence section. The effect was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop of deception. The radio intercepts from Quicksilver II proved a massive army was in Kent. The aerial photographs from the Luftwaffe proved it. The sonic ranging reports from the coast proved it. Every single technical intelligence source available to the Germans was screaming the same message. FUSAG was real, it was massive, and it was aimed at Calais. The deception was almost complete. The physical, visual, and auditory evidence was overwhelming. But there was one final, crucial link missing. To make the German High Command act times on this information, to make them bet the entire war on it, the evidence had to be confirmed by their most trusted assets in the field. Their own human spies, the inflatable tanks, the phantom radio signals, and the dummy infrastructure created a powerful multi-sensory illusion. But the deception planners at the London controlling section knew that physical evidence alone was not enough. German intelligence would, and could, be skeptical of reconnaissance. To make the lie unassailable, it had to be confirmed by the one source the German High Command trusted above all others: its own human intelligence network, its spies on the ground in England. The Allies had to ensure that when the Abwehr asked its top agents to verify the rumors of Patton's army in Kent, the answer that came back was a resounding yes. This was the masterstroke of the double-cross system. And at the center of that system was a single man, a Spanish double agent so effective, so trusted by the Germans, that he would become the linchpin of the entire Fortitude deception. His British codename was Garbo. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia. Pujol was not a trained operative. He was a former chicken farmer and hotel manager from Barcelona who, having witnessed the horrors of the Spanish Civil War, developed a profound and equal hatred for both fascism and communism. He decided, with a bizarre and messianic fervor, that he must personally contribute to the downfall of the Third Reich. In 1941, he approached the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. He was promptly rejected, seen as a fantasist. Undeterred, Pujol executed a plan of breathtaking audacity. He instead went to the German Times embassy, presented himself as a fanatical pro-Nazi, and offered to spy Times for them in England. The Abwehr, desperate for assets, accepted him, gave him a crash course in espionage, a codebook, and a bottle of invisible ink, and sent him on his way. Pujol, of course, never went to England. He moved to Lisbon, and using only a blue guide to Britain, a map, and railway timetables, he began to invent his intelligence reports from whole cloth. He created a vast fictional network of 27 sub-agents, a KLM pilot, a Welsh nationalist, a censor in the Ministry of Information, a disgruntled U.S. Army NCO. For nearly 2 years, he fed the Germans a stream of plausible, detailed, and utterly fabricated intelligence, all of which was eagerly consumed and paid for by the Abwehr. He reported on convoy movements from Liverpool, which he gleaned from public shipping news, and warned of military buildups that didn't exist. His reports were so convincing that by 1942, MI5, who had been intercepting these messages, realized with dawning horror that the Germans had a master spy in Britain, who wasn't even in the country. They finally made contact, and, in April 1942, spirited him to London. Once in Britain, Pujol was given the codename Garbo, the world's greatest actor, and paired with an MI5 handler, Tomas Harris. Harris, an art historian and fluent Spanish speaker, was the perfect partner for the creative, volatile Pujol. Together, they were not just agent and handler, they were a writing team, a two-man production company scripting the war for an audience of one, the German High Command. Harris and the XX Committee now had the ultimate weapon, a direct line to the Abwehr, with a source they considered infallible. Garbo's fictional network was now on the ground and ready to report on the FUSAG buildup. The partnership of Garbo and Harris became the central nervous system of Operation Fortitude. When the 603rd Camouflage Engineers inflated a new regiment of rubber tanks in Kent, Garbo's agent in the area would send a coded message to Berlin reporting on a new American armored division arriving, complete with the unit insignia the Ghost Army had just painted on their fake vehicles. When the 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion began broadcasting the phantom radio traffic of a new Corps HQ, Garbo's contact in the Ministry of Defense would report on a high-level staff transfer. Harris and the deception planners scripted every move. They used Garbo's network to corroborate every piece of physical evidence the Allies were planting, creating an airtight, inescapable logic loop. The Germans' own most trusted spy was confirming everything their reconnaissance planes and radio intercept stations were telling them. The statistical scale of Garbo's deception is staggering. Between his arrival in 1942 and the end of the war, his fictional network sent over 500 radio messages to Germany. These messages, totaling hundreds of thousands of words, were so valued by the German High Command that in July 1944, Juan Pujol Garcia was awarded the Iron Cross by Adolf Hitler himself for his services to the Reich. His most critical performance, however, came in the hours just before and during the D-Day landings. On June 5th, as the real invasion fleet sailed for Normandy, Garbo sent a message warning of an imminent landing, but insisted it was a diversionary operation. Then, in the early hours of June 6th, he sent his masterpiece, a multi-part, high-priority message, supposedly from his network, reporting that the Normandy landings were underway. He confirmed the unit identities, which the Allies times wanted times the Germans to know, but argued passionately, with all his hard-won credibility, that this was a feint. The main attack, he insisted, the decisive one, was still being prepared by Patton's FUSAG, and it would strike, as he had always maintained, at the Pas-de-Calais. This message was rushed to Hitler's headquarters. It was the final, definitive piece of proof. The physical army was in place. The radio signals were broadcasting. And now, the human intelligence confirmed it. But the deception needed one last, catalyzing element. It needed a star. It needed a commander for FUSAG so aggressive, so feared, and so times believable times that Hitler would have no choice but to accept the entire production as fact. By the spring of 1944, General George S. Patton Jr. was, paradoxically, both the Allies' most famous general and their most significant liability. To the American public, he was old blood and guts, the hard-charging, pearl-handled revolver-wearing victor of the Sicily campaign. To the German High Command, he was something far more. He was the time's Panzer General Asterisk, the one Allied commander who truly understood and practiced their own doctrine of high-speed, mobile, armored warfare. They respected Montgomery. They were wary of Eisenhower. But they times feared times Patton. He was the one man they expected to lead the decisive blow against the Reich. However, within the Allied command, Patton was a pariah. After infamously slapping 2 shell-shocked soldiers in a hospital tent in Sicily, he had been relieved of command. He was a general without an army, sidelined in England, his career effectively over. The planners of Operation Fortitude, masters of turning weakness into strength, saw this situation not as a problem, but as a golden opportunity. They realized they could weaponize Patton's reputation, his infamy, his aggressive persona, and the Germans' obsessive focus on him could be forged into the most powerful magnet in their arsenal of deception. Patton himself, initially, was not even aware of the full extent of his role. He was simply the bait. Schaeff planners reasoned that the German High Command would never believe that the Allies would sideline their best armored commander for a mere disciplinary issue right before the main invasion. They would interpret his punishment as an obvious ruse, a clumsy attempt to hide the fact that he was, of course, being given the most important job, command of the main invasion force. Patton's personal diaries from this period, collected in the Patton Papers, are a testament to his profound frustration and his unwitting role in the deception. He was bored, angry, and felt humiliated. "I am in the anomalous position of being the most senior corps commander in the theater, and having no corps," he wrote in early 1944. He chafed at the inaction. This frustration was precisely what SHAEF needed. They leaked his presence in London. Then, in a carefully staged piece of theater, they gave him command of the, still fictional, 1st U.S. Army Group. Patton was now officially in charge of the Phantom Army. His movements became the single most watched indicator of Allied intentions. The deception staff choreographed his every public appearance. He was sent on a high-profile tour of Kent and East Anglia, the heart of the FUSAG buildup. He inspected the rubber tanks of the Ghost Army, his 3-star flag flying for all to see. He gave bombastic, warlike speeches to local officials, knowing that leaks were inevitable. Each of these events was meticulously planned to be observed by German aerial reconnaissance or reported on by Garbo's network. Garbo himself sent urgent messages to Berlin, reporting that his agent near the new FUSAG headquarters had positively identified Patton's staff car and personal standard. To the Germans, this was the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence. The Phantom Army was real because Patton was leading it. The German High Command swallowed the bait whole because it confirmed everything they already believed. Their own intelligence assessments, particularly those from Times General Feldmarschall Times Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, and General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, were fixated on Patton. Post-war interviews and captured Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, situation maps show this obsession clearly. They referred to the force opposite Calais not as FUSAG, but as Army Group Patton. They believed the Allies had two main forces, a secondary, diversionary army under the cautious and predictable Montgomery, and the primary, decisive assault force under the brilliant and aggressive Patton. Their entire defensive strategy was therefore geared toward meeting and defeating Patton at the Pas-de-Calais. The Patton Magnet was a massive success. The resources dedicated to his fictional headquarters were a testament to his importance in the plan. His HQ was established at Knowle House in Kent, and the 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion broadcast a constant, high-priority stream of radio traffic appropriate for a general of his stature. The statistical correlation was undeniable. Every time Patton's name was leaked in connection with FUSAG, German radio intercepts spiked. Every inspection he conducted triggered a new flurry of urgent reports from Garbo's network. Patton, the disgraced general, was single-handedly holding the attention of the entire German 15th Army. He was the keystone that locked the entire, sprawling deception together. The rubber army, the phantom signals, and the master spy were all powerful components. But it was Patton's name, his reputation, that gave the lie its terrifying and unassailable credibility. The bait was set. The stage was complete. The star actor in place. The only question remaining was whether the ultimate audience, Adolf Hitler himself, would truly believe the performance. The complex, multi-layered deception of Operation Fortitude, the rubber tanks, the phantom signals, the master spies, was aimed at a single, ultimate target. This target was not the German 15th Army, nor was it the Abwehr, nor even the German High Command, OKW. The true target was the mind of one man, Adolf Hitler. By 1944, Hitler was not just the head of state, he was the Times Oberster Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht *, the supreme commander of all armed forces. He no longer listened to his generals. He dictated their every move. And his strategic decisions, once lauded as genius after the 1940 blitzkrieg through the Ardennes, were now increasingly based on a rigid, messianic intuition and a profound distrust of his own professional military staff. This intuition was the very bedrock upon which the Allies built their deception. Hitler's mind, the planners at the London controlling section correctly deduced, was fixated on the Pas-de-Calais. To him, it was the only logical, strategically sound location for the main Allied invasion. It was the shortest route across the Channel, it offered the best air cover, and it was the fastest path to the industrial Ruhr Valley, the heart of the German war machine. He saw the vast, exposed coastline of Normandy as a backwater, a suitable place for a diversion perhaps, but never for the decisive blow. This personal, unshakable conviction was the single most important factor in the entire German defensive strategy in the West. This fixation was not just a passing thought. It was codified into unchangeable military law. On the 3rd of November 1943, Hitler issued Times Führer Directive 51 *, a document that would seal the fate of his armies in France. The directive began with a stark warning. The threat from the east had stabilized, but the danger in the west remains. Hitler then laid out his core belief. A belief that Operation Fortitude would spend the next 7 months amplifying. He wrote, "I can no longer justify the weakening of the West in favor of other theaters of war. Should the enemy succeed in breaching our defenses on a broad front, the consequences would be incalculable." Most critically, the directive specifically warned his generals not to be fooled by the exact strategy the Allies were planning. Diversionary attacks on a large scale, Hitler dictated, are to be expected. This applies not only to diversionary landings, but also to operations against the invasion fronts themselves, Calais, with the object of tying down our forces there, and of deceiving us as to the sector chosen for the main attack. He was, in effect, warning his generals to expect a feint at Normandy and to hold their main force at Calais. This one document became the foundational doctrine for the entire German defense. It legally and psychologically obligated every German general in the West to treat Pas-de-Calais as the Times Schwerpunkt *, the main point of effort. In post-war interrogations, Hitler's top commanders, General Feldmarschall, Times Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, and General Alfred Jodl, the OKW Chief of Operations, spoke at length about the paralyzing effect of this directive. Rundstedt, an old-school Prussian aristocrat, privately held Normandy as a serious possibility. But his hands were tied. Directive 51, and Hitler's constant reinforcement of it, meant that he was not allowed to move the strategic panzer reserves without the Times Führer's Times direct, personal approval. And Hitler would not grant that approval for an attack he believed was a feint. Jodl testified that Hitler's belief in the Calais invasion was absolute, reinforced daily by the intelligence reports generated by Garbo, the radio intercepts of FUSAG, and the reconnaissance photos of the Ghost Army. The Führer, Jodl explained, was convinced that the main invasion was yet to come at Pas-de-Calais, even after the Normandy landings. All the reports seemed to prove it. The physical and statistical deployment of the German army in France on the eve of D-Day is the ultimate proof of this fixation. The entire German defense was weighted, fatally, toward the wrong target. The German 15th Army, commanded by General Hans von Salmuth, was deployed at and around the Pas-de-Calais. This was the most powerful German army in the West, comprising 19 divisions, including several elite infantry and panzer formations. It was dug in behind the most formidable sections of the Atlantic Wall, supported by a massive concentration of heavy coastal batteries, such as the Times Battery Lindemann *, whose guns could hurl shells clear across the channel. By contrast, the German 7th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Dollmann, was responsible for the long, sweeping coastline of Normandy and Brittany. This army was a shadow of the 15th. It was composed of 7 lower-quality static divisions, many of them filled with older men or non-German conscripts, the Times Ostruppen *, and lacked significant armored reserves. The disparity was not an accident. It was a direct, physical manifestation of Hitler's will. He had placed his strongest wall, his best troops, and his most powerful guns in front of Patton's Phantom Army. This is the central genius of Operation Fortitude. It did not try to implant a new, foreign idea into the mind of the enemy. That is the hardest task in psychological warfare. Instead, it did something far more subtle and devastating. It identified the enemy's single, most deeply held, unshakable prejudice, and then dedicated the vast, coordinated resources of the Allied intelligence and deception apparatus to methodically, brilliantly, and overwhelmingly times confirming times it. The trap was now set. The bait pattern, FUSAG, the physical evidence, the human intelligence, was all in place. And the target, Adolf Hitler, was staring right at it, his conviction stronger than ever, waiting for the attack he knew was coming. June 5th, 1944. A force 6 gale thrashes the English Channel. Rain and low clouds scud across the French coast, rendering the seas impassable and the skies blind. For the German High Command in the West, this is a day of relief. The invasion, which they had been anticipating with rising tension for weeks, could not possibly come in this weather. The barometer was falling, and the meteorologists at the Luftwaffe's central forecasting station in Paris promised at least several more days of impossible conditions. In this atmosphere of confident relaxation, the most capable defensive general in the German army, General Feldmarschall times Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B and the man responsible for the Atlantic Wall, made a fateful decision. He packed his bags, climbed into his staff car, and left his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon. He was driving home to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6th. He was certain he would be back long before the Allies could even consider a landing. This supreme misplaced confidence is captured in the meticulous records of the German military. The Times, Kriegstagebuch, or War Diary, of General Hans von Salmuth's 15th Army, the powerful force garrisoning the Pas-de-Calais, shows a headquarters on high alert, but for the wrong place. Their entries for June 5th are filled with reports of FUSAG activity, of Patton's movements, and of the continued buildup in Kent. They were braced for the main assault. But of Normandy, there was almost no mention. When the BBC, in its nightly broadcast to occupied Europe, transmitted the famous personal messages coded instructions to the French resistance, the 15th Army's intelligence officers dutifully noted them. But they interpreted them through the lens of fortitude. They logged the messages as just another part of the war of nerves, a complex deception to distract them while the Times' real-time attack, at Calais, was prepared. They were, in a tragically ironic sense, correct. The messages were part of a deception, but one designed to times mask times the truth, not create a new lie. Rommel's departure was the ultimate physical manifestation of Fortitude's success. In his post-war memoirs, Rommel's aide, Hauptmann times Helmuth Lang, described the scene at La Roche-Guyon. Rommel, Lang recalled, was convinced that no Allied commander in his right mind would attempt an amphibious assault in such seas. He had personally inspected the beach defenses and, while he famously complained about their inadequacies, he believed they would hold against anything but a perfect weather assault. His decision to leave was not one of negligence, but of supreme, logical confidence, a confidence born from the Allies' own meticulous deception. He believed the main attack was coming at Calais, and he believed it would not come until the weather cleared, likely in mid-June. His phone call to his wife, promising to be home for her birthday, was the act of a man who believed he had time. This single decision, predicated entirely on the Calais First theory, removed Germany's most brilliant, energetic, and aggressive defensive mind from the battlefield at the single most critical moment of the war. The weather hammer was the final, decisive blow of the deception, a factor the Allies had not planned, but one which their enemies fatally misinterpreted. The meteorological data from June 4th and 5th was unambiguous to the German forecasters. A deep depression was sitting over the North Atlantic, spinning off violent gales and low, thick cloud cover. Their forecast, upon which Rommel based his decision, was for continued, deteriorating weather for the remainder of the week. They saw the storm not as a temporary obstacle, but as a definitive barrier. What the German meteorologists missed, however, was a statistical anomaly, a brief, fleeting gap. At Eisenhower's headquarters, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief chaff meteorologist, was engaged in the most stressful forecast of his life. His own team was in violent disagreement. But Stagg, poring over the charts, in a position of extreme peril. The foothold was shallow, the men were exhausted, and the German defenses, though breached, were rapidly reforming. A single, decisive and well-timed counterattack from a fresh armored corps could still have driven them back into the sea. The success of D-Day was not secured on D-Day itself. It would be secured in the 2 critical weeks that followed. And this victory would be won not by the men on the beaches, but by the phantoms in Kent. D-Day was the first stunning victory for Operation Fortitude. The second, and arguably more difficult, was convincing the German High Command to keep time staring at a ghost, while the real invasion force bled, reinforced, and prepared to break out. The deception did not stop on June 6th, it intensified. In the headquarters of the German 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais, General von Salmuth's Kriegstagebuch times for the days following the invasion reveals a command not in a panic to reinforce Normandy, but on an even times higher time state of alert for its own front. Their intelligence officers, sifting through the reports, came to a fatal, logical conclusion. The Normandy landing, while larger than expected, was a successful diversion. Its very success, they reasoned, was part of the plan to draw the 15th Army's panzers south, thereby clearing the way for Patton's real-time assault. This bias was reinforced by the Allied deception teams, who now kicked their operations into overdrive. The 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion didn't go quiet. They exploded with new, urgent radio traffic, simulating FUSAG's final preparations for the assault. The Allied planners at the London Controlling Section and the operatives of the 23rd Ghost Army now began their second act. They knew the lie was fragile. As the days ticked by and the main invasion at Calais failed to materialize, skepticism in the German command would inevitably grow. They had to provide a new, compelling narrative. The story they crafted was one of bureaucratic infighting and Allied frustration. Agent Garbo, in London, began sending his most dramatic messages of the war. His agents inside Patton's headquarters reported that General Patton was apoplectic. He was supposedly furious that the Normandy diversion was bogging down and failing to achieve its objectives, thereby spoiling his own, much larger invasion plan. Garbo reported that Patton was demanding SHAEF launch his attack immediately, arguing that Montgomery's failure in Normandy proved that only his FUSAG could deliver the decisive blow. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. It presented the Germans with a narrative that was both believable and flattering. That the Allies were divided, their plan was failing, and their most aggressive general was confirming the Germans' own strategic assessment. The German High Command, from Rundstedt to Hitler himself, eagerly consumed this misinformation. It explained everything. It explained why Patton hadn't moved yet, he was waiting for the Normandy diversion to succeed. And it explained why the 15th Army must, under all circumstances, remain in place. They were not just guarding a coastline. They were waiting to engage and destroy the Allies' best army and most feared general. The industrial and statistical hammer of this post-D-Day deception is found in the Battle of the Build-Up. War in Normandy became a race of logistics. Could the Allies land men and material faster than the Germans could bring in reserves? For 14 critical days, from D+1 to D+14, the 19 elite divisions of the 15th Army, including vital, mobile panzer elements, were held immobile at the Pas-de-Calais. They did not move. This statistical paralysis was the margin of victory. While the 15th Army watched the ghosts in Kent, the Allies poured their real armies onto the Normandy beachhead. By June 20th, D+14, the statistics were staggering. Over 1 million Allied troops had been landed. With them had come 170,000 vehicles and over 500,000 tons of supplies. The fragile beachhead had become a fortress. The logistical race had been won. This victory, which set the stage for the entire liberation of France, was achieved only because Operation Fortitude held the 15th Army in check. The Germans' belief in FUSAG had cost them their last best chance to win the Battle of France. The deception held fast through the most critical period. But a lie, no matter how brilliant, cannot be maintained forever. By late June and early July, as the Allies prepared to launch their breakout from Normandy under the codename Operation Cobra, the lie was stretched to its absolute breaking point. The 15th Army was still waiting. But the patience of the German High Command was wearing thin. The price for this unshakable belief was about to be paid in full, not by the phantoms, but by the men of the 15th Army who had been forced to wait for an enemy that would never come. Late July, 1944. The sound of Operation Cobra is the sound of the German front in Normandy, not bending, but shattering. Thousands of Allied bombers have pulverized the German lines, and now American armored divisions, led by General Omar Bradley's First Army, are pouring through the gap, shattering the exhausted remnants of the German 7th Army. The breakout is on. The war of attrition in the hedgerows is over, and a war of movement has begun. And less than 150 miles away, at the Pas-de-Calais, the most powerful German army in France, the 15th Army, sits, still largely intact, its elite divisions waiting for an invasion that will come. The final, terrible price of Operation Fortitude was not paid by the Allies on the beaches of Normandy. It was paid by the men of the 15th Army, an army condemned to strategic irrelevance, dying on the vine as the war raced past it, having been comprehensively and tragically defeated by a ghost. The commander of the 15th Army, General Hans von Salmuth, was the first to realize the horrifying truth. In his post-war interrogations and the analysis of his headquarters war diary, a picture emerges of a man in a state of dawning, sickening realization. Throughout late June and early July, even as the Normandy bridgehead solidified, he had been dutifully reporting the continued FUSAG threat, based on the non-stop radio chatter and phantom activity in Kent. But by mid-July, as the reports from the Normandy front grew more and more desperate, the lie became untenable. Salmuth began to frantically recommend the large-scale transfer of his elite panzer and infantry divisions to the Normandy inferno. His requests were met with denial, skepticism, and delay. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, with Hitler's personal approval, still clung to the Calais deception. They were still receiving reports from Agent Garbo that Patton was furious, still waiting to launch the real attack. Hitler, incapable of admitting his intuition was wrong, refused to release the 15th Army wholesale. He permitted Salmuth to send divisions south, but only piecemeal, one at a time. It was the worst possible decision. These elite units, which could have formed a powerful counterattack force, were instead fed one by one into the meat grinder, arriving on the Normandy front, exhausted, disorganized, and just in time to be destroyed by the building Allied superiority. The final, panicked realization at the top came too late. On July 2nd, the aging Times General Feldmarschall Times von Rundstedt, who had long harbored doubts, was dismissed by Hitler and replaced by Times General Feldmarschall Times Gunther von Kluge. Kluge, a more energetic commander, arrived at OB West, assessed the maps, and was seized with a cold panic. He saw the massive Allied buildup in Normandy, the disintegration of the 7th Army, and the absurd, powerful deployment of the 15th Army guarding an empty stretch of coast. In post-war testimony, Kluge's staff described his fury and despair, his immediate realization that the entire FUSAG apparatus had been a gigantic bluff. Kluge finally understood the deception, but he understood it at the exact moment that it was no longer possible to correct the error. He had inherited a catastrophe, and his only strategic reserve was in the wrong country, psychologically speaking. The statistical hammer of this failure fell with Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th. As the American armor broke through, Hitler finally, belatedly, screamed for the 15th Army to move. The entire army was ordered to abandon Calais and race south to stem the tide. The order was a logistical fantasy. The Allied air campaign, which had systematically destroyed the bridges over the Seine and the French railway system, now reaped its final dividend. The 15th Army's panzer elements, critically short on fuel, crawled south, only to be savaged from the air by swarms of Allied P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons, who owned the skies. The infantry divisions, lacking motor transport, were forced to times march times to the front. They were overrun, bypassed, and annihilated without ever firing a shot in a coordinated battle. The few elements that did reach the new front line arrived exhausted and demoralized, just in time to be encircled and destroyed in the cauldron of the Falaise pocket. The 15th Army, the most powerful German force in the West, was destroyed without ever fighting its intended battle. The phantom army of Operation Fortitude had achieved its final grim victory. It had not only frozen the 15th Army on D-Day, it had held it in place just long enough to ensure its complete and total destruction when it finally tried to move. The lie had done its job. The strategic balance in France was now permanently, irreversibly broken. The Allies, however, now had a new and curious problem. Their phantom army had been ×2 times successful. They now had to find a way to quietly kill FUSAG, because its famous, feared commander, General George S. Patton, Jr., was finally being unleashed for real. August 1st, 1944. As the remnants of the German 15th Army are being fed piecemeal into the inferno of the Falaise Pocket, and the 7th Army has effectively ceased to exist, a new, real army is born on the continent. General George S. Patton, Jr., the Phantom Commander, the Magnet of Calais, is driven to a quiet headquarters in Normandy. There, he is secretly given command of the newly activated U.S. Plast, 3rd Army. The transfer is the final act of the play. The ghost of FUSAG, having held the stage for 6 critical months, is finally dismissed. The real general, the one the Germans had feared all along, is now, at last, being unleashed. But he is not at Calais. He is in Normandy, and he is about to pivot and drive a spear through the heart of the German army in France. Patton's personal diaries from this period are a raw, unfiltered torrent of his explosive, primal energy. He had been held in reserve for so long, forced to play the part of a decoy while the main battle was fought, that his impatience had reached a boiling point. His entries from late July, just before activation, are a mixture of prayer and profanity. "God, I hate to wait," he wrote. "The thing to do is to get this thing over." He scribbled a prayer for good weather for Operation Cobra, not just for the other generals, but for himself, knowing his chance was about to come. On the eve of his activation, he wrote with characteristic, brutal confidence, "The 3rd Army is going to be the fastest thing in history." When the order finally came on August 1st, it was as if a dam had broken. The real Patton, no longer a ghost, was now free to practice the very kind of high-speed armored warfare that the Germans had so rightly feared and so fatally mislocated. His real mission was the antithesis of the FUSAG deception. He was not to conduct a frontal assault across the strait, Calais. He was to lead a classic cavalry, style breakout times south times, from the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, then pivot times east asterisk, racing for the Seine, and threatening to encircle the entire German army group. The decoy had become the executioner. As the real Patton was being born on the battlefield, the phantom Patton had to be killed off. The deception planners at the London Controlling Section and the operatives of the 23rd Ghost Army could not simply go silent. This would alert the Germans that they had been fooled, and the Allies still needed to tie down German reserves for future operations. FUSAG had to be methodically and believably dismantled. The 23rd Ghost Army packed up its rubber tanks and moved on to other, smaller-scale deceptions. The radio traffic of the 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion did not stop abruptly. It was slowly tapered, simulating the transfer of FUSAG's fictional divisions to other commands. The most important task fell, once again, to Agent Garbo. He had to provide the Germans with a final, face-saving narrative. His network reported that, due to the unexpected bogging down of Montgomery's forces and the failure of the Normandy diversion, the entire Allied invasion plan had been changed. General Patton, his sources reported, had been transferred in disgrace or reassigned in frustration to a new secondary army in Normandy to try and salvage the situation. FUSAG itself, Garbo reported, was being disbanded, its divisions absorbed into other army groups. This final lie was perhaps the most brilliant of all. It prevented the German high command from ever having to reckon with the full, humiliating scale of the hoax. They were not fooled by a phantom. They were simply victims of a change in Allied plans. This allowed them to continue to believe, even as France collapsed, that their original assessment of Calais had been correct. The statistical juxtaposition of the Times real times Patton versus the Times fake times Patton is the ultimate measure of Operation Fortitude's success. The Times phantom times Patton as commander of FUSAG, was a paper army of over 1 million men, armed with 1,100 inflatable tanks. This ghostly force, with almost no combat power, successfully held 19 elite German divisions, over 300,000 men, and hundreds of tanks immobile for the most critical 8 weeks of the campaign. The Times Real-Time's Patton, as commander of the Third Army, began his assault with just 8 divisions, roughly 250,000 men. In the next 30 days, in one of the most astonishing armored advances in history, this real force would race 600 miles across France. It would liberate 87,000 square miles of territory. It would inflict over 100,000 casualties on the German army, capturing nearly 40,000 prisoners. The Times Real-Time's Third Army was the very picture of speed and power that the Germans had so fatally mislocated at the Pas-de-Calais. The Ghost Army, FUSAG, had completed its mission. It was arguably the single most important and decisive unit of the entire Normandy campaign. By neutralizing the 15th Army, it had guaranteed the Allied foothold, it had won the Battle of the Buildup, and it had set the stage for the breakout that would liberate France. The lie, having served its purpose, was now being quietly packed away. It fell to the real armies of steel and blood to finish the job, leaving the greatest hoax in military history to pass from a top-secret military file into the annals of history. Late 1944. The fields of Kent are quiet. The endless parks of rubber tanks, the dummy landing craft, the camouflage trucks, all have vanished. The roads, once clogged with the staged convoys of FUSAG, are now used by simple farm vehicles. The Phantom Army has evaporated, its mission complete, its existence already fading from a top-secret file into a historical footnote. The sheer scale of Operation Fortitude was, and remains, unprecedented. How did this colossal hoax, an undertaking of such complexity, succeed so completely? And what, in the final analysis, was its true legacy? The success of Fortitude was not a single lucky break. It was a perfect storm of deception, a symphony of interlocking lies where every component reinforced the others, creating a reality more compelling than the truth. The official post-war SHAEF report on the operation, a document of dry, understated military prose, concluded that the plan had succeeded beyond all expectation. It credited the right plan, the one developed by Colonel John Bevan and the London Controlling Section, which correctly identified the enemy's psychological weak point, Hitler's unshakable fixation on the Pas-de-Calais. It credited the right tools, the academic precision of the double-cross system under Sir John Masterman, which provided a trusted, direct injection method for the lies, and the artistic, obsessive detail of the 23rd Ghost Army, which gave the lie its physical body. And it credited the right target, the rigid, intuition-based command structure of the Third Reich, where one man's prejudice was law. The German High Command, from its most senior generals to its most junior intelligence analysts, was comprehensively and fundamentally fooled. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, would testify after the war, with a mixture of professional awe and bitterness, that they had been utterly deceived. We had. Completely false. Information on the Anglo-American grouping, he stated. He admitted they believed Patton's army group was the main force, and that Normandy was the diversion, right up until the moment it was catastrophically too late. The deception was so total that it even fooled the one man who might have seen through it. Baron Alexis von Roen, the chief German intelligence analyst for the West, was the man who received Garbo's reports and the FUSAG radio intercepts. He dutifully, and with high confidence, assembled them into the terrifying logical picture of the Calais invasion force. In a tragic irony, von Roen was part of the anti-Hitler conspiracy. He was arrested and executed after the July 20th plot. But his failure was not in his analysis. His failure was that the Allied deception was simply too good. He was a brilliant analyst fed a perfect, false data set. The final, industrial-scale measure of this cost-benefit analysis. On one side of the ledger, the cost. The U.S. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the core of the visual deception, numbered just 1,100 men. The London Controlling Section and the MI520X Committee were a handful of planners, academics, and case officers. The price of the inflatable rubber, the loudspeaker trucks, and the radio equipment was statistically negligible, a rounding error in the Allied war budget, less than the cost of a single day of the Normandy campaign. On the other side of the ledger, the result. This small, creative, and inexpensive force successfully neutralized the entire German 15th Army, a force of 19 elite divisions, numbering over 300,000 battle-hardened men, and held it immobile for 8 critical weeks. The return on investment was, perhaps, the greatest in military history. This is the ultimate legacy of Operation Fortitude. It was the pivotal, silent victor of the Normandy campaign. We return then to the coast of Kent, and to the thesis established in the opening days of 1944. The D-Day landings did not succeed times despite times the formidable power of the German 15th Army. They succeeded times because times of it. That army, the strongest in France, was the anvil, held firmly, immovably in place at Calais. It was held there not by steel chains, but by a masterful, intricate, and overwhelming lie. By holding that anvil steady, Operation Fortitude allowed the hammer of the real Allied invasion to strike at Normandy and shatter the German defense in the West. The greatest invasion in history was, in the end, made possible by the greatest hoax, an army of phantoms built of air, rubber, and imagination.